This is Absolute Radio Frank, celebrating Frank Skinner's 60th birthday.
This is Adrian Chiles on Absolute Radio Frank, interviewing Frank, which is a great privilege. Did you select me for this, Frank, or was I forced upon you?
You were suggested to me, and after some wrangling, I gave in. I was worried that people won't understand two accents like this, but, you know, I think we're available in the West Midlands, so that'll be good.
What did you listen to when you were a kid? What's your first memory of local radio? It must be West Brom related, surely.
It was BRMB in Birmingham, obviously. Two things. Les Ross's breakfast show, which included things like a sort of regular sitcom, which was a Western, which used to be on every day. I don't know who did the voices. There was never any credits. And then the sports stuff was a bloke called Tony Butler, who you may remember.
Very well.
Who's fabulously, his catchphrase was, okay, which no one's never nabbed for themselves, to my knowledge.
So when you went to the Albion, you stayed to the end. My granddad used to drag me off early so many times. We were driving away, and I heard Tony Butler say, goal at the Hawthorns, Tony Trethui. He said, bad news, Tone, West Brom conceded, Liverpool has scored in the last minute here. Brutal stuff.
Well, I never saw any of those goals, because those were in the days when we stood on the terraces, and I saw about 4 West Brom goals a season, if I was lucky. And they did, incredibly, they did score more than that, in case you're wondering at home.
So we're celebrating your big birthday. Your first birthday memory is very clear to you, isn't it? It's unusual.
Yeah, it was. I remember sitting on the bed and saying to my mum, I'm 4 today. And it's nice to have a first memory that you can put an actual date on. And there might have been earlier memories, but obviously that one is quite significant. So I now move towards a point, of course, where I won't be able to forget, I'll be able to remember them again. But it's funny how things level out in the end, isn't it? There's a sort of ramp at each end of life.
Now, as the youngest child, traditionally, you're either spoilt or you're sort of mercilessly put upon and bullied. Which was it in your case? I
was spoilt, definitely. There was 7 years between me and my next brother, so. I felt a bit like an only child who lived with some other people. But there was 2 brothers and a sister I had, and when I was a very young kid, the 3 brothers were we were in the same rooms. There were 2 of us in a double bed and 1 in the single bed. And then the oldest one, Terry, started drinking and coming in, you know, drunk and being sick and all that sort of stuff. So I got into that sort of lifestyle quite early. I don't think you can get secondary drinking, but I sort of did.
Who was it you shared a bed with? Was it Keith or Terry?
Me and my brother Keith shared a bed, and then we got bonks, which was a big moment. So I think I had the top bunk, and he was beneath me.
Keith got a walk-on part in one of your sitcoms, didn't he?
Keith, my first sitcom was called Blue Heaven, and he angled in it. If that, I don't know if that's a verb. They're called anglers. Do they angle? Anyway, he angled against a sort of a West Midlands sunset. And I remember they said for timing they were going to have to cut it out. And I said, if you cut this out, you'll ruin my life. So they had to keep it in. I don't think I've ever worked with a relative since, because you have to make those emotional decisions.
Didn't somebody ask him how he knew you? And he said, I used to sleep with him.
He did. Something. He did, yes. Well, he's not the only person who answered that.
You get to pick not every song for yourself, but they do give you a certain amount of leeway.
Yes. So I get to pick the next one. The next one's pretty easy, because it might be my favourite song of all time. It's certainly in the top 3 or 4. And I've probably heard it 10,000 times, and it's never even dipped for a second. Right. It's called The Roadrunner by Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers.
Absolute Radio, Frank.
Just going back to school days, Frank, ever since I've known you, you had this thirst for learning. Did that manifest itself as at a young age, or is it's something you sort of worked your way into as you got older?
No, I don't think it did manifest itself at a young age. I wish it had manifested itself earlier on, because at school, I'm one of the few people that you meet who I love school, but the reason I loved it is because I just larked around for the whole thing. And I can't decide whether to blame myself for being foolish, or whether I feel that the education system let me down and should have spotted that it had a rare gem in its hands.
But there must have been a teacher who, don't know, just made you sit up in your seat and gave you some kind of hunger for learning somewhere before the age of 18 or 16. Sure.
I don't think I had that one teacher who... I'll tell you what I did have. I got expelled from school, and then I worked in a factory, and then I decided I wanted to do more with my life. And I did teacher training badly, and I failed the first year. But there were two women on that course who were taught on that course, and they were called Marilyn and Marjorie. And they said at the end of it, look, you're a terrible teacher. You don't want to be doing that. But the actual English bits of this course, you've got the best marks on the whole course. You should be on an English degree. So I said, I can't get another first-year grant. This was in the days when people got everything paid for. And they said, try. So I phoned up my local authority, and I basically lied about... I said, well, I'm on a 4-year course, so I do want another first-year grant, but this is only a 3-year course, so you won't actually be losing any money. And I made that up, and no one checked anything, so I got the grant. But brilliantly, Marjorie, on the last tour I did in 2015, she came to one of the gigs in Birmingham. And I don't think you were there, but there were several West Brom players. There was a crowded dressing room of people who'd come to see me, relatives, mates. And I was able to sort of bring Marjorie into that room and say, I just wanted to say, you don't know who this woman is, but she honestly changed my life. Because she fought for me to get on that English course. And when I was on that English course, that's when my brain started expanding. I think that's when I realised that learning was like at the centre of my universe.
Was there one moment where that became apparent? Was there one sort of book or one novel? I often think novels are wasted on teenagers. They're first reading when you're a bit older.
Well, everything's wasted on teenagers, with the possible exception of acne. But I think Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, the poet, when I first read that, that completely blew my mind. There's a few poets, Tennyson and Gerard Manley Hopkins. I think it was the poetry that got me. I'd never read, really. The entire extent of my poetry experience was Muhammad Ali doing, he used to do poems in interviews and stuff. And it'd be stuff like... and if he's still alive, he'll fall in 5 and stuff. It wasn't elaborate work. But I still either read or listen to poetry every day of my life. And that's, 40 years on. Without
the learning, without the engaging your brain and getting it really going with literature, could the comedy have happened? Or did you need that stimulus? That was a difference.
Well, the comedy's been an ever-present, really, since I was a small child. So I always... made people laugh at school, at work, in the pub, and that was my main passion in life. And I've always been a comedian. People would say, you became a comedian, when you were 30. No, I didn't. I started doing it on stage when I was 30, but I took it as seriously. My need to get laughs was as strong if I was sitting on a bus talking to someone as it is, standing on stage at a big theatre. So that I would say I was always a comedian. And then there was a slight little moment when I went up to a professional one, but it was still basically the same process.
Absolute Radio Frank.
You say you'd always wanted to be funny.
No, I never said that. I said I always was funny. How dare you? Dare you rewrite that sentence?
So you can remember people finding you funny when you were even 6. Did you ever remember? Yeah. Did you ever remember failing to make people laugh when you were 6?
I think my standards were probably lower then. So I was happy with a smirk. Now anything less than a guffaw I mean, I have my volume now, what I would call my volume. And I couldn't, if we had graphic equalizers, I couldn't reproduce it. But when I do a gig, I know instinctively what my volume is. And if I don't get my volume, even if they've been laughing, then I feel I failed.
Oh, and what's the sweetest sound? Well, there's different kinds of laughter. There's laughter which melts into applause. I mean, that is nirvana, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I've never really bought into the applause thing because, politicians get applause. But I don't see it as in the hierarchy of audience sounds. I don't see above laughter because I think applause is much easier to switch on and off than laughter is. Say if somebody does a song, it could be a slightly rubbish song on a comedy song now. A rubbish one doesn't get any laughs, and people will applaud at the end. But that just means that that's a convention, whereas laughter always undermines people's conventions. Sometimes people don't want to laugh, and they just have to laugh, and that's the real victory. It's interesting when people say, comedian, what they do is they make people laugh for a living. It's the use of the word make I find very interesting. It sounds like people don't really want to, but it's almost like tickling. You're forcing them into it.
Whenever I spend an extended amount of time with you, and the first time I did so was when we went on that road trip across America. We went from Las Vegas to Houston.
Yes.
Us two and another friend of mine. And I remember you said something. You made a joke about, we were somewhere on the Mexican border. This is like name dropping, this is like place dropping, but we were somewhere on the Mexican border, and there was a little shop, nondescript shop, and a huge aerial behind it with kind of a round kind of satellite dish type thing. And you said, that tambourine shop's doing a good job of its signage. And I thought at that moment, I began to get slightly worried about you because it felt to me like you're almost tortured by comedy. You almost sort of can't switch it off.
I don't want to switch it off, though.
It's relentless. No, I love listening to it. I just wonder if you ever get tired of just of thinking up funny things.
Well, I've got to say, I'm laughing at that because I forgot.
You enjoy your own jokes, which is nice to say.
Yeah, well, I'd forgot that joke completely, but of course now we wouldn't be able to see that joke. So it'd be behind a massive wall. I think less so now. Actually, before I did it professionally, I think I probably couldn't let an opportunity go without trying to be funny. I would have props in my pocket for in the pub and stuff like that. I used to do a thing with cling film and pretending I'd sneezed and I hadn't got a handkerchief. I won't go into too many details. I used to do that in the pub. I used to take a knot and bolt onto fairground rides and drop it to pretend that something had fallen off the big wheel. So it was always there, but I love it. I love it so much. There'll be jokes I do at home which I just do over. If ever my partner Kathy, you know very well, is a very fussy eater, and if ever we go out for a meal or she's eating at home, and I say, how's that? And she says it's a bit oily, I always say, well, it's only 1:45. And even when it isn't 1:45, I've been saying that now for 10 years. And even when I said it then, it makes me happy.
There was just one other one when we got to Galveston. I don't know whether you remember.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like a seaside resort, but it had half been blown away. Do you remember?
Yes, it was a hurricane.
And something or other had its wicked way with it. When we got talking about holidays you used to go on, you talked about being going to Bewdley on holiday. And I said he said I was just a kid. We had like a caravan by the by the river. And he said Terry went out fishing, but he was a rubbish fisherman.
Keith went fishing.
Sorry, Keith went fishing. He said Terry just drank, and then just in about 1/10 of a second, you said. Well, I said your one brother fished like a drunk and the other one drunk like a fish.
Yeah.
You'd never thought of that before, but it's an act of almost insanity to be able to come up with that.
Well, Dennis Leary, the American comic, I remember when he moved to LA, everyone he knew was having therapy. And he phoned me up and said, promise me you'll never have therapy of any kind, he said, because I've realised that comedians' brains are wired in a certain way. And if you let someone in there, they're going to put in more orthodox wiring. And you might have a lot less pain in your life, but you'll have a lot less laughs. What do you think of that as a swap? I said, no, I'll stick with the laughs.
What's your next track?
Well, one of my great loves is Velvet Underground. There's a certain sort of pre-punk New York moshy sound which I love, and they epitomise it. I particularly like this track, which is called White Light, White Heat.
Absolute Radio Frank.
We're talking about music. There is a kind of, you describe it as a fuzzy, muddy sound. I mean, the best example of that is The Fall, where it's all mud, it seems to me, on occasions, and fuzz. Where did that come from? Because Elvis isn't like that, and Elvis was your first love.
Well, Elvis was like that when he started out. When Elvis was at Sun Records, it's got that moshiness. I think the first music that really, really moved me was 50s rock and roll. And I think I look for the 50s rock and roll in every bit of music I hear to this day. And what it's got, it sounds like some people have got together on a street corner. And it's got all the rough edges on. And one of the reasons I really struggled was because when I was in my teens and got, mega into music, all my mates were listening to Pink Floyd and stuff like that. And I found I couldn't cope with the polished, sort of pure nature of it. I like things that sound a bit like somebody building a shed. What
was the first time you remembered that happening? Like Little Richard used to say, could feel his toe shooting up into his boot when he heard. So when's the first time your toe shot up into your boot? Well, my brother gave me an Elvis album. He gave me a bunch of albums. They were all in the wrong sleeve. My brother was not, he didn't care for vinyl. And that, that sort of inner sleeve, he thought that was like just packaging, so he used to throw that away. So for years I thought it was Elvis's Golden Records I had, but it wasn't. It was a different album that was in that sleeve. And there was a track on that, which is actually a Little Richard cover called Rip It Up. And when it went into that, I remember thinking, oh yeah, this is the music I'm going to be liking. It was one of my first hairs going up on the back of the neck. But I still get, I can still think of those moments. First track on Elvis Costello's first album, first track on the Ramones' first album, first time I heard the Smiths. Those moments when you hear someone and think, I'm already in love. And certainly it happened with The Fall. And where were you? Just going back to that Rip It Up, where were you? Sitting in your house? Was there a record player? Where was it? There was a Dan set record player, and it would have been preceded by a lot of because it was in terrible state. And then this voice came out. And I know it's, I think people now think Elvis was a bit naff because they think about the jumpsuits and all that. But he, to me, is still what any sort of alternative music that your mum and dad doesn't like, music that gets you by, in the entrails, he still epitomises that for me. So it's visceral. Absolutely.
Absolute Radio Frank.
It's been fascinating, Frank, going back and reading your first book, which I read first time round and loved it. It was before I knew you, before we'd even met. And it just strikes you what a different person you are in there to what you are now. Going back and rereading it now I know you well. Well, I mean, it's 17 years ago that I wrote that book, and I once heard a Radio 4 programme where they had a bloke on who he studied sea anemones. That was his job. And the interviewer said, a very good question. How do you know when they're dead? And he said, well, growth. If you can't measure any growth over a period of time, we officially class them as they're no longer alive. And so if I was the same bloke I was 17 years ago, I would officially class myself as dead. I said to Emily Dean, who I spoke to this morning, I said, the thing is, I didn't know Frank then. And she said, well, lucky you.
Yes. Well, I don't know if you'd have liked me when I was a drunkard and stuff. I mean,
I'm not talking about the drunk years. I'm talking about, the time when you were writing that book where you were super successful. You just don't seem, absolutely compelling, but I just think you might be a nicer person now. I think I'm probably, I think I was always a middle-aged man in waiting. I've always believed, even as a child. I'm not calling being 60 middle-aged. That suggests that I'll live to 120, which, I'm all for modern medicine, but I don't think that's going to happen.
But I sort of have grown into myself a bit, I think, and I feel happier now. At that time, when I was in the tabloids all the time and stuff like that, I think I was a bit more edgy, a bit more tense, and I'm still capable of being unpleasant, but I think then it was. I always felt like it was show day. I felt that sort of anxiety you get in your shoulders when you know you're going to be on telly in a minute.
Do you think you were conforming to a stereotype which either you'd invented for yourself or had been put upon you? You know, the lad, you know, it was a bit sort of, I don't know, there's a bit, you're almost like a comedy Liam Gallagher at times. There's a bit of a strut about you, albeit with a lot of self-deprecation.
Well, I think that's what I was like. I mean, one thing about my work, it's always been very autobiographical. Even on telly, I always talk about myself and stuff. And so that's who I was then. And I think, I was still fresh from Birmingham. And then, of course, I spent some time amongst the chattering classes in the capital. And now I've mellowed somewhat.
The next song, do you call them songs or tracks? When I say tracks, my daughters like, laugh at me in derision.
I won't laugh at you in derision, whatever you call it.
All right. The next one is the Ramones.
The next disc.
The next disc, yeah. The next tune. Why the Ramones?
Well, when people go to things dressed as the people on stage, I don't know if you've ever done that, but, if people used to they'd go and see Culture Club dressed as Boy George and stuff.
Or the Jam.
The classic wannabe thing. The last time I did that was the Ramones gig at the Birmingham Odeon, and I went in the ripped jeans, white pumps, and the biker jacket and all that. And that's how much I loved them. The first time I heard the Ramones, my world slightly changed forever. And again, it's that thing, it's just raw and it's from the gut. And it sort of breaks down all that falseness and phoniness that you have to put up with in the world.
Which track are you going for?
It's called California Sun, which I love playing that in January. But the riff on it is one I've always loved.
Absolute Radio, Frank.
Music obviously sustains you and obsesses you and everything. Are there kinds of music we just can't bear? If you got to a desert island and there were 8 discs there and you looked at them and thought, I'm just not playing them. I'd just rather die here baking in the sun to no soundtrack than that. I find it difficult to say. Most genres I've had a real try with. When in the days when there were more record shops about, CD shops, I used to stand and look and think, I bet there are artists in here who, if I heard them, would change my life, and I'll probably never hear them. But funnily enough, I think that the one track that always sends a shiver through me is Imagine by John Lennon. That I know is regarded as a great classic, but I despise it. And then there's people who I used to like Police and Eurythmics, I used to really admire. And now I just find them, and Madness, something to do with my drinking years, I think, which is what they all coincided with. I can't listen. I do listen because I play them for professional reasons. But all of those I can no longer cope with. It's a worry, isn't it? Because there might be someone I love now. Not that I loved them, but people I like now that I will despise in years to come. It's something to look forward to. Emily said something to me interesting once about her reading. She said, I'm very disciplined about reading. I force myself to read. I read stuff out of my comfort zone. And is it possible to be like that with music? I've sort of taken that on with music. I thought, I'm going to force I'm going to listen to that all the way through twice.
Well, I'm deep into Beethoven string quartets at the moment, and it doesn't come easy to me. But I keep finding bits that I really, really like. And so there's enough to keep me. It's like the odd little lamppost in a very, very dark street. I've just got a sense it'd be worth carrying on with it. And I think it's always good to do that. I think any sort of reading or music that feels a bit like an intellectual workout is good for the soul.
Absolute Radio Frank.
This is Adrian Chiles on Absolute Radio Frank, interviewing the said Frank. In the many things you've achieved in your career, just having a radio station given over to yourself, that's a big thing. That's a beautiful thing.
It's great. It's like staging a coup in a Central American republic. The first thing they always seem to get is the radio station. No, it's great. It wasn't my idea. I was very, very thrilled to hear about it.
When you're choosing your records for the records, I've used an archaic term again.
I'm happy with that.
When you're choosing them, at first that must be a great feeling, because you've never done much music radio, had you, before? Then it must be a lovely feeling. It's like your own Desert Island Discs every week.
Yeah, well, I try not to celebrate it too much, because I don't know if anyone else here has the same contract. So I get two choices an hour. And one of the reasons I came to Absolute was that I thought that, generally speaking, their playlist is great. You know, there are some stations I just couldn't cope with the playlist. It would drag me down too much. But to be able to embroider an already beautiful tapestry with my own stuff is it's a novelty and a joy that has not worn off over the 7 or 8 years.
We were just talking just off air a minute ago about the Oasis brothers, if I can call them that, and you said
Jeff and Steve Oasis.
Yes, yes, those two. But you were saying about Liam Minogue. I said I knew them, in the 90s when we were sort of all quite mega. When you look back on your mega years, I mean, I don't think you're any less mega now than you were then. But what?
That's kind of you. But why do you think I've taken over Absolute 90s? Because I think that's his crowd. I went to Dublin earlier in the week, and I went into one of those gift shops to buy. I actually bought a sort of penny whistle for my son, and the woman said, "I just wanted to say, I love you. The other people in the shop are too young to recognise you." I thought, oh, no, I think it was. I'm loving everything that happens now, and I'm probably working more than ever. And, I'm still on telly a lot, still doing live, love doing the radio, etc., etc. But I do think the 90s was that was when I was in, the 3 a.m. girls were talking to me and stuff like that. So it's that, I mean, I always say that there was a secret conference of celebrities in the 90s when we got together and said, look, it's too much, the workload is too much for talented people. Let's bring in a whole load of people whose job is just celebrity and let them do some of the dirty work. And that's why they had reality shows and all that. And those people have done a sterling job as our celebrity support staff. And I used to do all that. There was a magazine voted me Party Animal of the Year in about 96 or something like that. And
you hadn't had a drink for 10 years.
No, exactly. But I just went to stuff because the novelty of being invited to showbiz parties, it took about 10 years to wear off.
Your next pick is Tempole Tudor. I was always baffled by them as a kid. The name was just strange. I found them a worry on Top of the Pops. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what they were about. Can you help me?
I think if they toured, a worry, Adrian Chiles would be a very good quote for the poster, because that's one of the things about them is they were basically medieval night punks, which is a great combo. They wore quite a lot of heraldic clothing and stuff. I mean, I think I established in the first hour, I love that sort of New York sound. But I love bands who sound English bands who sound English. I have a problem when people say to me, oh, Amy Winehouse was so brilliant, and it's really opened her heart. And I thought, if I did a stand-up tour in which I spoke in an American accent, I'd be booed on stage. But Tempole Tudor, to me, sound not only like an English band, but an English band from the 15th century. And I'd say Wunderbar, or Wunderbar, if you like, is probably their piece de resistance.
Absolute Radio, Frank.
The likes of Tempole Tudor, where are they now? I love sort of Wikipediaing some of these kind of acts, and it's fascinating what becomes of them.
Yeah, you have to be careful with Wikipedia. I remember once I was on a show with Faye Tozer from Steps, and I said, so you're quite a successful trampolining champion. She said, I'm sick of people saying that. I've never been on a trampoline in my life. And that was one of her Wikipedia. Tempole Tudor, I went out with a woman who had a child by the I think it was the guitarist or the bass player in Temple Tudor. That's how much I liked them. I just wanted any link would do me. But no, they were, I think, yeah, I have never had a problem with the one-hit wonder phenomenon for obvious reasons, maybe. But I just think there's a lot of people who have no hits who you hear taking the mickey out of one-hit wonders. And I always think, look in the mirror, mate. No hit wonder.
What do you think would have been different about your career when you were starting out? And obviously trying to promote yourself and make a go of comedy, if you'd been in the social media era, when now you can't do it without being either brilliant or at least very enthusiastic about Twitter and Facebook. Would you have embraced that, do you think?
Well, I think I was very lucky in that when I came along, that wasn't around. Because I think, for a start-off, there's a phenomenal amount of joke theft. I mean, Emily Dean, who I do the radio show with on Saturday mornings, is always telling me about someone delivering a joke on Twitter that I've done that morning, and I'm delivering it as their own. So I can't abide. The comedy police of the 90s would have stepped in straight away on that one. I also think that when I started, I was a sort of pioneer. There was about 35 comics I knew who were making a living on our sort of, what they call the alternative circuit. And now there's about 450 in that same thing. And it's like when you see old footballers, you see some of the greats and they don't look that great. I think it's good to be around in the formative years is definitely an advantage.
So I know you'd always been trying to make people laugh, but you were 30 before you went on stage at a paid gig. Do you think it's a bit like, we criticise politicians for never having had a proper job before and don't know anything about life? Do you think that was to your advantage that you'd worked in a factory, you'd the teacher training, etc., degree, you'd done other things?
Yeah, I think that what you realise is that you've been researching being a stand-up comedian for 30 years, but you never knew it. And I think that's true of most if you were going to be a novelist or a playwright, it's all grist to the mill. It's all that works. And there are people who, Jack Kerouac, the American writer, basically, apart from one road book, wrote about his childhood, ad infinitum, out reworking it. So it's great for that. You realise that your life has basically been sausage meat, and now you've suddenly got a sausage-making machine and you can start banging them out.
Absolute Radio Frank.
Rereading your first book, I have to tell you, it doesn't speak well of me, but I felt real proper envy at one bit, where you spoke of your birth certificate, where the words Western Bromwich appear on it sort of 3 times, don't they? It's not on mine. Mine's just Birmingham.
Yeah, mine says, born in the town of West Bromwich, in the borough of West Bromwich, in the district of West Bromwich, I think. There was no escape.
We both support the same football team, but I forgot about the story about your dad. Like West Brom, in a way, brought him to Birmingham in the first place. He met your mum.
Well, this was, he played for a club called Spennymoor United in County Durham, and they got drawn against West Brom in the third round of the cup. They were a non-league team, and he came down with the squad. I'm never sure if he actually played. But while he was down here, they lost 7-1, by the way. Those were the days. And while he was there, he went to a pub that night, and 2 blokes said, do you want to come to a party? We're having a party. And the way he told it was he thought they were both lowlifes. So when they asked him his name, he said Len. His name was actually John, but he didn't want to give them his real name because they looked so dubious. And then he went, but they turned out to be my mum's brothers. And so he ended up meeting my mum and marrying her as a result of having been at the Albion. That's what brought him down to the West Midlands.
So never went back?
I think he went back briefly and then came back down again. But he still happily told my mother the story about the fact that her brothers were such low lives and he wouldn't give them their real name. It was insensitive of him, I thought. But it could be said that without West Bromwich Albion, I would never have been born.
And what kind of class were they from? You call yourself, you're proper working class background.
My dad was very very working class. I mean, his dad had, they both was a miner, and my dad had worked in the mines in County Durham. And they were classic, I mean, pigeons and whippets and, cigarettes and flat caps. They were absolutely the sort of people you can only really picture in black and white now. Seems so long ago. And my mum also, would tell stories about, my granny literally, boiling up the bones to make soup, and that was it, for that day and stuff. So they knew poverty like I never knew. We were just basic, living in a council house, outdoor toilet, working class folk.
Is it true that your mum said when you first met your dad's parents, they were both smoking pipes? That can't be true.
No, that is true. I have actually seen a picture of my granny smoking a nice little clay pipe. Yeah, it was a different world. I mean, it was a long time ago, obviously, as we're establishing with this fabulous anniversary channel.
And your mum saw him coming in a dream, didn't she?
She actually won, I think it was, she won 5 shillings in a newspaper saying that she'd seen this man being brought down from heaven by angels, and then 3 years later she met him, and it was the same bloke. And that incredibly was my dad, who was like a real wild, drunk troublemaker of a guy who'd been born down by angels, incredibly.
So perhaps Bennymore is heaven.
Well, I just think he was thrown out of everywhere else. He was probably thrown out of there as well.
But we get to the fall. A band in your honour I've really tried to get my head round, and I just can't.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can get through it.
Well, that's no way, is it, to approach music. I heard this particular track. I was in my car one night. I used to do a lot of late night driving when I was, in the early days of comedy. And I was listening to John Peel, I think it was, and he played Spoiled Victorian Child. And weirdly, I thought, I love that. These are one of those bands. The hair went on the back of my neck, and I thought, I'm just going to listen to them. And then I never got round to it for about 5 years. And finally I got a greatest hits album, and I thought, you know what, I was right. These are the best band in the world. And even the lead singer wouldn't like that, because he thinks they should be called a group. That a band has to have trombones in it. But anyway, yes, this is The Fall with that very track, Spoilt Victorian Child.
Absolute Radio, Frank.
What do you think your parents wanted for you?
I think that my mom didn't have those sort of big ideas. I think she'd just grown up in a world where ambition was not appropriate. My dad advised me very early on to go into showbiz if I possibly could. Get on the bandwagon is what he used to say. So once you're on the bandwagon, he said, look at some of them people on the... He said, look at that Aspel. Got nothing. No talent. He said, but he's on the bandwagon.
Did he have a thick Geordie accent, your dad?
He had... I couldn't really spot it, but all my mates used to take the mickey out of the fact that he's... there was someone from When the Boat Comes In living in my house. But so he was very impractical. I think he had aspirations, my dad, even though he just, worked in factories and things.
But it's almost exotic, is it? There weren't many Geordies in Birmingham at that time. There was plenty of Scots about who'd come south looking for work. I don't recall meeting a Geordie anywhere till I went to college or something.
No, well, he, like I say, he got here by fairly exceptional circumstances, a mixture of football and love, which has powered both of us through the years as well. So, yeah, that's a very good point, actually. Some of his relatives followed him down, I remember. I had an Uncle Jimmy came over, who looked very much like my son, actually, had same colour hair and eyes. And Uncle Jimmy came around and they had a row. And they went outside for a fight, which was quite a difficult moment, two brothers. And Jimmy took his coat off and threw it down, and a car went over it. And he said, that's gone on me coat. And my dad said, I think yourself lucky you weren't wearing it. And they just collapsed in laughter and then just went down the pub. That was the end of that argument.
And when you look at Buzz, what do you want for him?
Buzz, I should say, is my 4.5-year-old, in case you don't know. What do I want for him? I want him to be a top-order stand-up comedian. I really would like him to be a stand-up comedian. I'll do what I can to push him in that direction.
He's got that gene somehow, hasn't he?
He's already funnier than a lot of people making a living out of it. I mean, to me, he endlessly says things that completely crack me up. I know people say that about kids, but they don't have his timing.
And is there anything you wouldn't want him to do with his life? I mean, because whatever you don't want him to do, he will do. I mean, kids just do. You don't want him to drink, he'll drink loads.
Yeah, I mean, there are dark things. Obviously, there's lots of dangers and temptations for, kids nowadays. But I think I would just like to be around long enough to get to the point where he doesn't want me to be around anymore, which is, as you know, that happens with kids. Mm. And then I can either die quietly, or I can finally return to my study and read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Absolute Radio Frank.
Reading a lot about your dad, again, your first book, you see, he was quite a funny guy, but quite an angry drunk.
Yeah,
he had that shot in his lock.
He could be volatile. I mean, he was fabulously entertaining, and he's the man who got me into, like, singing and telling jokes and watching football and boxing and stuff like that. So he's an amazing influence on me. But he was a lot harder than me. He was built, like a barrel. So I couldn't have adopted that side of his personality without getting regularly knocked out.
So what were you like with a load of drink inside you? Again, you'd stopped drinking 20 years before I met you.
Well, I like to think I was great. And then after I packed up, people who I thought were, extremely heavy drinkers told me that if they were approaching the bar and they could see me in there when they arrived and they knew I was on one, as they'd say, like, a 3 or 4 day bender, they used to just turn around and go out because they couldn't cope with it. And I was shocked by that because I thought I was endlessly entertaining as a drunkard. But I suppose every drunkard does.
So why do you suppose that was? Did he become acid-tongued or just sort of garrulous? Or
I suppose I did... they get very repetitive, don't they, drunks? And I'd just be troublesome. I used to get thrown out of pubs for... I remember I sang Last Train to San Bernardino, I think it was called, and accompanied by the large ashtray banged on the bar, and that shattered into 1,000 pieces, and then I got thrown out, and then I had a fight with the bloke. I say I had a fight, I basically got knocked over by somebody outside. And life could be like that. Me and my dad went drinking once. I was meeting a woman at midday, and he said, come and have a pint with me first. And I woke up on the floor of our house at 4 o'clock. We'd both been thrown out the pub. So I don't know how it happened, but me and my dad, I picked up his motto, and when he spoke about drink, he used to say none or enough. And I found none to be too difficult to cope with.
It always strikes me when I think, I've never drunk like that, but I sort of drink a lot. Just what a waste of time it is sometimes. And all the time you've saved by not drinking. It takes a lot of time to build up to it, to think about it, to plan it, to do it, and then to recover from it.
People never mention this, but one of the big blows when you stop drinking, one of the things that's really hard to cope with, it's like 24-hour days have suddenly become 34-hour days. And we all think that's great, but suddenly there's a big chunk of extra time. And that, I think, ultimately is why I started doing comedy, because I just felt like it's, some strange lunar eclipse and the days had got longer and I had to fill them with something.
But also you used it, still learning all the time, improving things. And the time I might choose, I'll just go for a couple of pints. You'll go to the opera, or you'll go to a gallery, or you'll see some obscure film or something.
Well, that is true. I mean, I went to the opera this week with my friend Baroness Bakewell to see The Rosenkavalier, which is 4.5 hours long. Not happy with that. On the way there, I listened to an audiobook about the history of Rome. So I find it exciting. I find I love football and that kind of, that stuff that's easier, if you like. But I like the feeling of, those, they're called Van de Graaff generators, when you get like a spark going. I can feel that between my ears on moments like that, and that's the best feeling ever.
Kraftwerk. So there's a German theme going on here. Even Tempole Tudor, quintessentially English, had a German title to this.
I've always loved Germany, I must say. I feel part of me has some sort of allegiance. I love the whole... I think it's still okay to call it krautrock. That's what it's officially called. You know, I like that stuff. And when I first heard Kraftwerk, I couldn't believe it was so different. You know, there was something like a 6-minute single in the charts, which was... Autobahn, with people sounding very German and sounding like they were from the 22nd century. This is probably their most well-known track called The Model, which has got one of my best lines ever, where it says, she's a model and she's looking good. I'd like to take her home. It's understood. And it's fabulously exotic. It's a world I would like to spend some time in, the Kraftwerk world.
Absolute Radio, Frank.
Does being 60 worry you? Being 50, as I'm exactly 10 years behind you almost, is worrying me to death.
Well, I love free stuff in all its manifestations, and it's one of my big thrills. It's never worn off. Someone sent me a spork to the radio show the other week, and, a cross between a spoon and a fork. I was thrilled. But my bus pass came this week, my 60-plus bus pass. And even though I knew free travel was the headline flashing in my mind, mortality was the slightly smaller writing just under it. So it's all right. Being 30 was tougher, because when I was 30, I was unemployed and I had a drink problem. And my best mate's girlfriend, I remember, said to me, so what's it like being 30 and on the scrap heap? So I don't feel I'm on the scrap heap now, so there is that. But but to die and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot.
So what drives you now none of those things are going to happen to you?
What drives me is I still really care. I still, if someone said to me, I mean, this happens, people say, oh, could you come and do a 10-minute thing, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's just I still want to do it absolutely to the best of my abilities. And if I don't, if I feel I've let myself down, I will feel that in my shoulders for about 3 days. And I really, I love this job in all its manifestations. And I think I have a moral obligation to do it as well as I can do it.
So I was born 8 miles down the road from you, a proper white middle-class boy in a very middle-class neighbourhood in Hagley. What would you have been different if you'd have had that I was quite a relatively wealthy upbringing I had. When you were proper kind of working class.
Well, my dad used to say that if he won the pools, we'd get a small holding in Hagley. So you were living on Mount Olympus as far as we were concerned. I think I probably would have been different. I think it was... Yeah, it's weird how, things that feel like tough or not that pleasant in your life, when you look back on them, can be beneficial things. And I think if you've been... This is a cruel way of putting it, but if you've been a loser, there's a part of you that remains a loser. And if you've been poor, there's part of you that's always poor, no matter how much money you get. And I can still feel that in my joints, and I think it's good that I still feel that.
Celebrating Frank Skinner's 60th birthday. Absolute Radio, Frank.